Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School initiative. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, we have my conversation with Dr. Kathryn Mills, Associate Professor at the University of Oregon and the Director of the Developing Brain in Context Lab. Kate and her colleagues examine how social environments influence the development of social cognition during the transition into adolescence, using a blend of methods including behavioral observation and magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. Adolescence is one of the fastest and most consequential periods of human development. In particular, the many behaviors we as adults witness in adolescence, in school, in community settings, or at home, are in large measure an outward manifestation of what is happening inside their brains, which is rapidly becoming both stronger and more efficient, and ultimately enabling young people to realize their full potential among our social species.
I like to frame understanding the different things that we may observe at different developmental periods as developmental tasks. We have different developmental tasks at different stages of life. And when we're in our teen years, or let's just call it around puberty and post-puberty, we're really trying to understand ourselves. We have all these cognitive capacities coming online, this heightened motivation to connect and engage with others. And these serve the developmental tasks of this time. We need to understand where we are in a social species. We need to understand our rank. We need to understand how we relate to other people and who we are. And the parts of the brain that are changing during this time are parts of the brain that help us navigate other people and navigate understanding ourselves.
In part one of our conversation, Kate and I talk about the Developing Brain in Context Lab at the University of Oregon, what it does, the people who work there, and its evolving research interests. The concept of co-created developmental science, the engagement of community partners directly in the research process, the unique features of brain development during adolescence versus other periods of human development, and how the brain is both getting more efficient and stronger during this time period. In part two, we talk about what's happening in the brain when educators and youth workers and parents witness some of the hallmark developmental behaviors in adolescence, like identity formation and agency, what kinds of learning approaches and environments are necessary to best foster positive brain development among youth, the considerable variability of changes in the developing brains in adolescence, and the intersection of those changes in the brain with all the changes that are happening in educational and youth development settings at the same time, the current research on the effects of technology and social media on adolescent brain development, as well as the connection of developing social cognition and mental health, including how the process of adapting to new social situations in middle school and the potential social anxieties that come with it may be predictive of more severe mental health challenges later in life. We also discuss the specific research interests of the lab going forward, which are being influenced by the interests of this current crop of young people and the world they are inheriting. That's in just a little bit. Now, here's part one of my conversation with Kate Mills. Well, Kate, it is such a delight to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So I listen to a lot of podcasts, probably too many, and there's one thing that makes me chuckle a bit. At the beginning, I feel like the podcast host always says something like, this is a topic we've wanted to talk about for a long time, or this is something I think a lot about. And I think that's funny because these people have done hundreds of episodes, and how could each and every episode be on the topic that they've been wanting to talk about for a long time, or something that they've thought about a lot? But sure enough, I find myself saying, even we've only done 40 so episodes, but I'm glad you're on the podcast because this is a topic that I have thought about for a long time and wanted to talk with someone about for a long time. And so in this case, the topic being the development of the adolescent brain. And I'm grateful to have your expertise here to do that. Before we get into the topic, let's let our listeners know a little bit about you. I first came across you and your work from another scholar by the name of Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's a well-known expert in psychology, cognitive neuroscience at the University of Cambridge with a specialty in adolescence, who I believe you studied under or with. And you yourself are an extremely accomplished neuroscientist currently at the University of Oregon, and you run a lab there that we'll talk about. Maybe just tell us a bit about when and why you got interested in studying the brain, and then the specific interest in studying the brain in adolescence.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I think it might be the other way. I've been really interested in studying adolescence and found myself studying the brain as part of my interest in understanding adolescence and just being fascinated with this period of life. I was really blessed to have a really great adolescence. I fell into a really good friend group. It was a magical time. And when I became a young adult, I worked with many young people who didn't have a great adolescence. And I was wondering, how can I be part of a community of scholars and practitioners and social workers who are working towards building a world that benefits adolescents, that helps adolescents navigate the world in which they're in. And I found myself drawn to understanding the brain's development. And I guess I started wanting to look into the brain because I realized so many folks were drawn to neuroscience evidence and convinced by neuroscience evidence to help folks around them to understand, like, what are the potential opportunities that are present in different periods of life. I wanted to be part of that conversation and learn more about how the brain develops so that I could figure out ways in which we can structure our world to benefit this period of life and to help folks navigate what could be a potentially stressful time.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a conference on middle school and early adolescence, and as part of the exercise at the beginning, kind of like one of those icebreaker things, we basically said, okay, you in the room, there were about 100 people. We said, okay, for those of you who've had a positive experience in middle school, go to this side of the room. And for those of you who had a negative experience in middle school, go to that side of the room. And for those kind of in the middle, just go in the middle. And it was probably like 1/3, 2/3, 1/3 positive, 2/3 negative, which I think registers with a lot of people. So to hear you say that you're on the positive side is actually a really good and interesting thing. And there are some of you out there.
Yeah, I should probably qualify that a little bit further. Middle school was rough, but high school is when I really fell into a good friend group. So yeah, it was a little bit of both.
That's interesting because I want to talk about that actually, because adolescence does span quite a wide range. So I mentioned that you run a lab at the University of Oregon called Developing Brain in Context Lab. So it seems clear, given the emphasis on the developing brain, that your interest is in young people when the brain is indeed developing. But I suspect that the word context is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of what you and your colleagues are trying to better understand when it comes to this specific period of human development and by extension brain development, and that is adolescence. So maybe just start by giving us a bit of a tour of the lab itself. Why does it exist? What is its mission? And maybe you can say something about the talented emerging scholars that you have working there with you.
Thank you. Yeah, and there are many. This is funny because our lab is actually in a transition point. So it is officially called the Developing Brains in Context Lab, and that's because my research and my training is in cognitive neuroscience. We focus on understanding how individuals differ in their brain development. So I do a lot of work comparing developmental trajectories of the brain, how the brain's developing structurally in particular. And what we've noticed is that folks can show different brain trajectories and how, for instance, the structure is changing, when it's changing, when it's starting to look like it's stabilizing in some way. And they can be completely functional and look just as variable as humans are in general. And so I like to really emphasize that neurodiversity is the norm. We see so much diversity in terms of how the brain is developing, and I want people to know that that kind of diversity should be expected and not necessarily considered, a deviance. And we try to understand what type of environmental influences can relate to some of the differences that we see. What's so amazing, I think, about this time, especially in adolescence, is it's a time in which the brain is still quite plastic. It's susceptible to influence, but it's also susceptible to our own influence. And when we're teenagers, we have a little bit more agency, hopefully, than when we're children, and we can have more of an influence on how our brain is starting to develop or how it's changing during this time. And so we try to think about what are the different contextual influences that can shape the brain's development, and then how does that relate to different outcomes for folks. That all said, we actually have shifted our focus more to understand how folks are navigating the world in general, especially in relation to climate change. But I've wanted to shift our work away from understanding so much the biology into understanding, well, now we know that the brain is quite plastic, that it is able to adapt to the environment it's in. So let's see, how are people adapting and what can we do to really support those different adaptations people are making during this time. I should give a shout out to some of the most recent work that we've done, led by graduate student Lucy Whitmore. She just completed a study where we were investigating how a measure of brain maturation called brain age. This is a mathematical technique of assessing someone's brain age as compared to their chronological age. This technique was developed for aging populations, so folks who are in the later stages of life where it's a little bit more linear in terms of the decline that we see in the overall brain structure. But this technique has been used more recently in adolescence to say things like, oh, this experience might relate to having an accelerated maturation of one's brain during this time, or individuals who show that their brain is a little bit older than their age might be at risk for this outcome. Scientists have been using this technique, but it hadn't yet been validated as an actual metric of maturity during this time. As I'm sure you've talked about with many folks, maturation's all over the place during adolescence, especially, cognitive maturity, emotional maturity, social maturity. And so Lucy looked at this to see, is brain age actually tracking with other measures of maturity? And what she found is it was tracking with how pubertally mature someone was in this 10 to 14 year range, but it wasn't tracking with cognitive maturity. So that's really something for us to think about when we try to say brain age is related to someone's overall maturity during this time.
That's interesting. That registers for me as a parent. We've got a 16-year-old and now a 13-year-old, so we're kind of in the thick of adolescence. And we noticed that in our older son, who definitely his development seemed to be off. Like, he seemed pretty advanced physically, and I would say maybe even cognitively, but socially, emotionally, he presented much younger. So it just seemed like a mismatch, which I think is sort of what you're getting at, that it's not a linear process necessarily. The overall sort of development, it can be kind of all over the map. And we talked on this podcast just about physical differences, cognitive differences, social differences, that variability. And for educators and youth workers, that can be one of the main challenges. We call it differentiation. How do you differentiate those relationships that responds to the individual student needs? And that can be really challenging. When I was looking through some of the material in the lab, and I appreciate the evolution of it, I think that's a really interesting kind of response to our present time. I was drawn to one idea that you seem to anchor at least some of your work on, this notion of the co-created developmental science approach. And the idea of co-creation has popped up on our podcast a number of times across a number of topics related to adolescence. It seems to be kind of one of those approaches or strategies that folks are using. From a research perspective, what is co-created developmental science, and what makes it, in your mind, a winning strategy for the type of work that you do?
Yeah, so I like to liken co-creation to a different movement that has been a part of psychological science recently and neuroscience, which is the open science movement. This is the idea that in the past, 15 years, folks have really shifted towards being more open, with being more transparent about the whole process behind science. This is about actually creating a project with a community partner, so someone who's not in an academic institution, who hopefully is part of the community you are actually investigating in the research question. And that can look many ways. It can be where you are working together with forming the questions and figuring out how we're going to go about answering questions that are coming from that community partner. One way I really like to approach it is figuring out what questions they may have, but then making us as a scientist do the work and finding the right measures and the right approach to try to address that question. Or it could be including community partners in the interpretation stage. Like, you've already collected some data and you're trying to figure out how would someone else who's involved in this actual community or a similar community, how would they interpret some of these results, and incorporating those perspectives into your work. That's not creating the project, but it's creating how we're talking about what we found.
Yeah, it's come up a lot with young people, co-creating with young people. In some cases, it has been measures of assessment, like there's this notion of student-led assessment. They're evaluating their own academic performance. They're working with teachers. But it's also a function of, like, where does expertise lie? I think it's just sort of a general sense like, oh, well, you're the expert, you're the researcher, you bring stuff to us. But there's a lot of expertise that is possessed by the people in the field who are working with kids all the time, whether it's in after-school settings or in-school settings, or parents and families and their experience. So tapping into that, I think, in the joint ways is a really cool idea. But let's get into the science here, because that's just what we wanted to dive into and what I've been waiting a long time to talk about and think a lot about. So in our work, which is in the K-12 education and youth development space, we talk about these two big jumps in human development. The first happening in early childhood, birth to age maybe 3 or 5, and then another one that happens in adolescence. And while these are similar in the sense of how rapid the development is and how big a leap the body and the mind take, they're quite different. So let's start with just the basics. In terms of brain development, what are some of the unique features of adolescent brain development versus brain development in other periods of life?
I have to give the whole picture before I get into adolescence. So before we're born, we actually have all the neurons that we're basically going to keep, like all the different brain cells. And one of the main things that changes is the number of connections between those brain cells. And if you were to look into the brain of, for instance, a 9-month-old or 1-year-old, you're going to find that there are way more synapses, these connections, than you would find in an adult. So an adult has about 60% of the synapses that an infant has. And so if you're looking in this early infancy range, you're going to see both this overproduction happening where more connections than we possibly need are starting to form in the brain. And you're going to start to see the pruning process as well, mostly in parts of the brain that are involved in the things that infants and young children need to learn. For instance, how to move around in the world, process sensory information, and coordinate movements in relation to sensory information. But what's so cool about adolescence is we still see evidence of the pruning process, so the reduction in the number of connections. And so I like to emphasize that this is still similar to the earlier period because there's a similar biological process going on. But because it's happening in different parts of the brain, we're seeing the sensitivity and the malleability in different processes that are unfolding at these different developmental stages, such as understanding other people or future planning or impulse control.
And then you mentioned different parts of the brain. So, for example, people talk about this notion of like there are certain parts of the brain that are specific to things like executive function, which is another area maybe sort of thought of as a developmental feature of adolescence. I presume there's probably some executive function that's in early childhood as well. I'm not entirely sure, but that's sort of one of the hallmarks that people see is that added executive function in the adolescent time period. There's a specific part of the brain that does that.
There's a network. Actually, it's not even just one part. It's how different parts of the brain are linking up and also how they're functioning. And that leads into my other biological process that's occurring, which is not only are we pruning away the connections that we're not using or not needing, which actually makes the brain more efficient, we're strengthening the connections that we do keep with this process called myelination. Myelination, whenever I talk about this in the classroom, I liken it to any wire that's connecting an electronic device. It's covered in rubber so that the electricity is going efficiently to where it needs to go. The same thing's happening in the brain because we have a part called the axon where an electrical signal gets sent through. We want to make sure that it is insulated. And that's what myelin does. So it's covering up the axon in such a way that it's going to be more efficient in sending the signals that it's sending. That's continuing through the teenage years as well. So it's not like there isn't anything online in terms of executive functioning for children. Of course there are, but we might start to see more efficient signaling. And of course reflected in our behavior and what we can see externally as we get older. We may see more engagement or heightened activity in parts of our brain that are involved in learning and motivation and reward seeking. All of these things wrapping up together, I think, just demonstrate this kind of heightened attention and interest and motivation that we see in adolescence that is not negative. It just may not be as easily tamped down as we might see in adults. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this time is that drive that might be seen more readily in younger folks than we see in older folks.
That was Kathryn Mills, assistant professor at the University of Oregon Department of Psychology and director of the Developing Brain in Context Lab. In part 2 of our conversation, we talk about what's happening in the brain as adults witness some of the hallmark developmental behaviors in adolescence, like identity formation and agency. What kinds of learning approaches and environments are necessary to best foster positive brain development among youth. The considerable variability of changes in the developing brains of adolescents alongside all the changes that are happening in educational and youth development settings at the same time. The current research on the effects of technology and social media on adolescent brain development, as well as the connection of developing social cognition and mental health. And we discuss how the future research interests of the lab are being influenced by the interests of youth today. That's coming up in just a little bit on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I spoke with Susan Rivers, Executive Director researcher and chief scientist at iThrive Games. Through programs and partnerships, iThrive uses gaming and game design to promote social and emotional learning and positive youth development. Importantly, young people who use and interact with iThrive curriculum and resources are full participants in gaming design, which is not only fun and engaging, it also taps directly into and helps foster critical aspects of their social, emotional, and cognitive development.
For young people to take their abstract understandings of the world, whether it's how they felt earlier in the day or how the prison system is not working for Black and brown young people, taking abstract feelings and thoughts and understandings and making it really concrete, for example, as a board game, really significant process that's happening there that adolescents are on the verge of just being able to do, to make the connection between concrete and abstract. And so moving in between what's abstract and what's concrete, and then building something that other people can touch and feel and interact with is really significant learning for young people to do.
You can listen to all my conversation with Susan on a previous episode. And now, here is part 2 of my conversation with Kathryn Mills. We have these observations, again, in the education and youth development world. We talk about some of the developmental features that professionals in our space recognize in the young people that they work with. Things like identity formation, agency, which you mentioned, things like self-worth and self-concept, self-efficacy. I was looking at some of the papers that you and your colleagues had put out. There was one that you recently did on adolescent girls and the images of themselves as learners and being academically capable. Maybe you could just spend a little bit more time connecting the dots for our listeners who are largely educators, youth workers, definitely some researchers, but mostly in the social sciences and advocates for young people. Connect the dots between those behaviors and those orientations that educators and youth workers recognize in young people that they are engaging with what is happening in the brain. You started doing a little bit of that.
So I like to frame understanding the different things that we may observe at different developmental periods as developmental tasks. We have different developmental tasks at different stages of life. And when we're in our teen years, or let's just call it around puberty and post-puberty, we're really trying to understand ourselves. We have all these cognitive capacities coming online, this heightened motivation to connect and engage with others. And these serve the developmental tasks of this time. We need to understand where we are in a social species. We need to understand our rank. We need to understand how we relate to other people and who we are. And the parts of the brain that are changing during this time are parts of the brain that help us navigate other people and navigate understanding ourselves. One thing we can think about is the brain is sensitive to what's happening around us and able to respond to our experiences in those domains, in the social domain, in the identity domain. I particularly focus on a network of brain regions involved in understanding other people. So that includes parts of the prefrontal cortex in the midline, parts of near the back, also in the midline. And we see substantial reduction in terms of the overall gray matter. If we use magnetic resonance imaging, we can actually look at the volume of gray matter in these different regions, and they're reducing by 14%, 15% between ages 8 and 30. There's work that I think is starting quite soon to use MRI to look more at the cellular changes that are occurring, but we actually can't count synapses with MRI right now. We can just infer that that reduction that we see in gray matter is reflecting somewhat of the reduction in synapses, but also reflecting other processes, for instance, some of that myelination I was telling you about. So the brain is sensitive to experiences during this time in the social domain and wiring in such a way that whatever experiences we have, we hypothesize is going to facilitate being able to navigate the specific social situations we find ourselves in. Other aspects of the brain's biological development, like that heightened motivation to engage in connecting with other folks, from having heightened social salience with the signaling we see and structures in the center of our brain, I think reflect this heightened motivation again to engage with others. So as we all see, hard to disengage teenagers and even children as well, but from that social connectedness, this hypersensitivity or awareness of the social dynamics going on, where someone might find themselves within those social dynamics, I would hope that educators understand that this is a really important process for young adolescents, actually all adolescents, to be going through, and that to have the space in order to do that, in addition to all the learning that they have to do as well at school. It's a really important time for social learning. The brain is really trying to understand how to navigate other people and how to navigate social situations during this time.
Yeah, as somebody who experiences that, whether you're somebody who runs an after-school program and you're working with adolescents and you're relating to them, what is it about that's happening in the brain that maybe is sort of helpful or interesting to be able to understand these behaviors?
I mean, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I know that in preschool and in early elementary school and throughout elementary school, social emotional learning is huge, and there's curricula dedicated to understanding how to navigate friendships, how to navigate different dynamics. I think emphasizing that kind of education is still just as crucial throughout that early adolescent period, that it should not completely be replaced with all of the things that we also want to teach. Those are all very useful, but there's still so much social and emotional growth that occurs during this time. That curriculum, whatever amount of time is dedicated to preschoolers, I think should probably still be dedicated to understanding the increasingly complex dynamics that folks need to navigate once they enter middle school and once they enter high school. The other is that there's a lot of variability in terms of where people are in their brain development during this time in particular. There's this shift in terms of how the brain is changing structurally in different parts during this transition between late childhood and early adolescence. And when that transition occurs, varies between individuals. We don't know necessarily what that functionally means, if there's this kind of qualitative shift in cognitive processes or something. But we know that there is variability in terms of when the brain starts to change, in terms of how it starts to shift and how it's changing during this time. We also know from that work that Lucy conducted that there's variability in terms of what we would estimate someone's brain age to be at this time. And this is nothing new to anyone who works with folks in this age range, because puberty is maybe the most visible way to see the variability that exists in maturity during this time. But because we silo folks largely by what grade they're in, that intermixing of different grades and different ages, I think, should be more incorporated into how we work with young people, because they're going to probably be spending time with peers that are more on their level if they are going outside of their grade age group.
It's interesting you said that, because that is a big part of our work that we're trying to do, which is there seems to be, I'll speak for myself as an observer. And again, I'm not an educator, I'm not a researcher, but I've worked in philanthropy and nonprofits, et cetera, that have had a special interest in this time period, both in school and out of school. But there seems to be a bit of a mismatch between the developmental needs, as you were sort of describing, and perhaps some of the experiences that we offer up to them in education settings or even in out-of-school settings. And I mean, adolescence is a pretty long time span. The Promise of Adolescence report from the National Academies that was out a few years ago talked about these 4 stages. There's early adolescence, which is, they say, is roughly ages 10 to 12, middle adolescence 13 to 15, late adolescence 16 to 18, and then young adulthood, which is from 19 all the way up to age 25. And, the delineations of these phases, they aren't hard and fast. They kind of blend together, and I'm sure young people go through them at different clips. But we're focused on like that early to mid-adolescence, so 10 to 15 is how we describe it. So one of the reasons why we focus there is because it's the time when young people are not only developing really, really fast, but they're also moving through markedly different educational environments. So think about upper elementary school. So you're in an elementary school environment. Middle school, I know it's not the same in every district. And then their out-of-school experiences also are shifting. Before, they were largely governed by their parents or families. And then I think you were alluding to, this sort of segues into being directed more by their own personal interest, the young person's interest. So I would love to hear how you think about the intersection of all of these changes that are happening in these environments that we set young people up in. And to your point, the relationships that are embedded in those environments, so all that sort of social interaction.
Yeah. Again, I know that schools have a lot to contend with, so I hesitate to like, oh, you should do this. But if there is a chance to continue with more social emotional learning and also engage with different age groups, I mean, middle school is particularly tough because you can't, have the 6th graders still able to engage with like the 5th graders unless it's a K through 8 school. But I think having opportunities to engage with in some way or socialize with folks at different grades might build some of those opportunities in.
Yeah, for sure. The structures are really kind of working against what the science is saying. I had on the podcast some architects from an architecture firm that specializes in designing learning environments for adolescents. And most of the schools in this country that were built probably long ago are not necessarily collaborative spaces. They're meant to be a long hallway with a bunch of classrooms that are isolated from each other. They have like little windows. You can't really see anything, as opposed to big collaborative spaces where there's lots more, as you were sort of describing, interactivity, even if it's just visual. They were talking about how designing a band room that was just all glass so that kids could walk by and they can kind of see, because it speaks to that sort of notion of developing interest, self-discovery, trying to explore, different things. There's some other hot topics in our world that I think you also address in your research, so I want to talk about just a couple of them. The effects of technology and social media is one. And a lot of times those are combined, but I wonder from a brain development standpoint whether these are kind of two different things. What is the relationship with these devices that we have? And then there's a social media piece, which is honestly become an enormous part of how young people engage and relate to each other. So what are some of the things that you're trying to understand about the role of technology and social media both on the adolescent brain?
So I might throw a bit of a curveball. I will first say that my reason for starting any research on understanding digital technology use and social media use stemmed from questions I would get repeatedly anytime I gave any kind of presentation about the developing brain. That would be the second question. The first question would be something about gender differences, and then the second would be, okay, so is the internet ruining my child's brain in some form? And I actually grew up on the internet, so I always thought, this is strange because you're asking me and I'm here, giving you this talk. So I did start looking into this for a few years and didn't find much evidence that it was a big enough worry for me to put more energy into. And I'm not the only one. There are folks, for instance, at the Oxford Internet Institute and University of Cambridge, who have done work in this domain and found small variants in terms of well-being or mental health. And that motivated me to no longer study that variable, social media use, digital technology use, cell phone use, and to investigating the factors that I hear young people say are really impacting their lives, such as how the climate's been changing and the lack of engagement that they see folks who can actually make a change. I've shifted focus away from even including any research with digital technology.
That's really interesting. Well, then you had mentioned mental health. Maybe we should talk about that one. It seemed to come to the foreground during the pandemic, but most of us, and knowing the literature, I think confirms this. It's been a pressing problem for a long time. What are some of the things that you all have done or have been working on to understand just the overall contours?
Yeah, so one of the studies that we are just about to wrap up, where we actually are measuring how young people navigate their social connections in middle school, so entering into 6th grade, because we wanted to understand how people are developing their way of understanding other people in response to how they're connecting with their peers during middle school. Because as you know, you're often put into a completely new environment. You might have a new peer group. You might have kind of a shifted peer group from what your peer group was like in 5th grade or in elementary school. And because we know that this is a time of heightened sensitivity to social connection, a lot of motivation to connect, and a lot of plasticity in terms of the kinds of strategies we might develop to understand other people and navigate other people. We are measuring that because other work that we do in our lab in later age ranges has looked at how developing a way in which we think about other people maybe too much could be related to a risk for increased depressive symptoms or other mental health difficulties. And so we want to see, is something happening early on when we know that there's a lot of brain plasticity in these areas of the brain that are involved in understanding other people, when we know that there's this heightened motivation to try to connect with others, is there something going on during this period that might predispose individuals later for depression or anxiety due to how they're trying to adapt to the social world in which they're in? And if there's something that can be done to help folks do that in a way that's going to lower their risk for, over ruminating or having a hard time in terms of having social anxiety or maybe even isolation and depression.
So I'm in Chicago, and Chicago Public Schools is a K-8 system, so they don't have actually traditional middle school. It's K-8 and then it goes into high school, which is how I think schools used to run until the middle school movement. But there is something interesting in all these transitions are happening in this time period? Like, you're going from one school to another. And certainly as a parent, you've experienced the shifting friend groups and the kinds of effects that might have on identity and anxiety and social situations and so forth. But it's interesting to think about how we're setting up the educational system and environment that during these times when there are these sort of transitions that may have, based on the studies that you're doing, may have longer term effects on our overall development. Is that the kid's fault for being an adolescent? This is like how we're setting them up, right?
Yeah, I mean, we as a species are set up so beautifully to be adaptable. That's the beauty of this species. That adaptation is wild, and we see so much of this adaptation and cultural progression happening in adolescence. But it's also a time of vulnerability as well, because they're adapting to whatever kind of structure in society that they're currently in. So yeah, it would be lovely to know what we could do to better serve or be able to identify and maybe intervene with folks who might be at risk for developing certain strategies of understanding other people and relating to other people that might put them at risk later on.
You kind of answered my last question at the top, which was what is next for your lab? But I am curious because for adolescents, the things that are on their mind seems to be climate change is one of the top, certainly things like racial and economic justice. And there's lots of things that they care about, maybe more so than other people care about. And so it's interesting that you have thought about reorienting your lab, co-created with young people. These things would come up, right? These are the things that directly affect in their future. So have you thought about specific angles that you want to take or specific lines of research that you want to go down?
100%. Yes, yeah. And I like that you alluded to the co-created aspect, because that's definitely how I view it. I want to be able to answer the questions that young people have. I want to be able to talk about what we do as a lab to young people and them say, okay, cool, like this is good information for me to know. And so that is one of the main reasons that we have shifted. The other reason is, of course, I am a parent and I worry as well about how we can sustain ourselves as a species when so much action needs to be taken, but it can really burn out the folks who are trying so hard but have some of the least amount of power to change things. And so I see young folks engaging in a lot of activism around climate change, and unfortunately that just needs to be sustained. I don't want to see people burn out. And so what we are trying to focus on now is identify the ways in which we can help folks be sustainable in their climate activism. What are the factors that can reduce the sense of hopelessness? How can we foster a sense of connection during this time so that this type of activism can continue? So some of the work that we're starting up is understanding how climate education or environmental education can relate to mental health. So if understanding about one's local environment actually increases a sense of agency that things can change, or that you know how you might be able to navigate what's happening and continue to work further. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just starting. So I don't have any answers for you, but I'm amazed when I get asked questions that seem like we should be able to have the answers for them already, which is, for instance, should children in adolescence be engaging in environmental education where they develop this love for nature if only they're going to see it destroyed later? And I think, gosh, we should know the answer of how we might engage in this type of work that can still help folks love and enjoy the world that they're in and still continue to fight for it, because we're going to just need that fight to continue for a long time.
Okay, this has been a super fun conversation. I'm so fascinated by the work that you and your colleagues are doing. Thanks so much for your contributions to our understanding of adolescence, and thanks for coming on the podcast to share your knowledge and insights with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun to talk with you. Hopefully we can talk again in a year or so to check back in.
That was Kathryn Mills, Assistant Professor at the University of Oregon Department of Psychology and Director of the Developing Brain in Context Lab. You can learn more about Kate and the work of the lab online at devbrainlab.org. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast and Remaking Middle School are products of Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia Center for Effective Youth Development, which you can visit online at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, or on Facebook and YouTube at Youth-Nex, and on Twitter X and Instagram at Youth_Nex. Lessons in Adolescence is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Sophia Moore. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website or on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.